The next person who is presenting is Arthuretta. I hope you will all stick around for her amazing workshop. She is a talented, oh my goodness, organizer, storyteller, speaker, committed activist. What am I missing, Arthuretta? Take it away in 7 seconds. The floor is yours. Thank you guys so much for coming to Open Space Planning. This was great.
Okay, let's give her the hands of thank you. The first thing I'm going to do is to pin my panel. And as I pin the panel, that means put them up so you see them instead of all of you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the beginning of why we are having this workshop. First of all, as many of you know, or we are in the form of, we're having a serious pandemic. And in that pandemic, African Americans are suffering disproportionately. We are dying more, we are being misdiagnosed, we are being just dealing with a lot of things. So what I want to do is to express to you what I felt when I found that out. I said to myself, we need to do something. We need to do something to make this government what it needs to be. So as a Bernie delegate, I wrote a resolution to make racism a public health crisis. And in making racism a public health crisis, it forces the system to identify the fact that there are structural things that cause us to suffer. The structural things are identified in the resolution. I'm not going to go through it right now because it is available on Google Docs and it's also available on the Democratic Party of Virginia's website. But I will say this, I am beyond pleased to be a Bernie delegate because the Bernie delegates gathered around, they said, you know what, you're right. And within 24 hours, we turned around a resolution, we got it through, it passed, and now it's going before the convention to be approved. At the time I wrote it, there was only one resolution. After that resolution, and because I have a network that's all over the country, I started sharing my resolution with all these different jurisdictions. And now would you believe there are 10 resolutions in the country? I just found that I sent my resolution to Montgomery County about a month and a half ago. When I first wrote it, because I wanted a friend of mine to help contribute. She was instrumental in pushing Montgomery County, Maryland to do the same thing. So we are doing some fabulous things. Thank you, Bernie delegates. What I'm gonna do next is to introduce my panel. I have an awesome panel and you are going to, I wish, Hal, are you on? I have a co-host here. If Hal is on, what I want to do is to, where is he? I want you to pull up my panel for me. The first person I'm going to pull up is, if he's able to be pulled up, is David James Max III. Hal, if you can find him and pull him up. The next person to be highlighted, if you can pull him up, is Tavares Floyd. Tavares Floyd is on. Can you find him and pull him up? Do you see him? If you can't, then I'm going to do it. The next person that's on the panel is Stephen Spitz, who co-authored the okay. Well then, Salma, can you do it? The next person will be Andrea Miller, will be the fourth panelist. Now, we're going to do our thing here, and we are going to have everyone viewable. Let's see.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think I can only spotlight them one at a time, and I missed the first few people. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. The first one I want you to bring up is Tavares Floyd. Tavares Floyd.
He is now spotlighted. He is the person everyone can see.
Everyone but me. Okay, hold on here.
Also, I'm not able to make other people co-host. Otherwise I would make.
I've already done that. That's fine. Tavares.
Tavares, yes.
Tavares, welcome.
Thank you so much.
I just want to say Tavares made space in his schedule to be here with us today. And I'm not going to officially introduce him. He has a phenomenal resume. I'm going to let him introduce who he is, but this is what I want to say about him. Tavares is a lawyer by trade. He specializes in civil rights law. He is a staffer to a chief of staff to an elected official. He advocates in all areas of social justice. He actually lives right here in DC. You know, I didn't know that. I didn't know you were right in this area. That is a beautiful thing. He has served in a lot of different boards, but he comes here today with a special message. And I'm going to stop there and leave it to you to share with us what you want us to know about policing and African American and Black lives.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being with us today. I think I got my screen right. The color was a little weird, but I'm working with it. And I have 3 screens up. So if you see me looking around, that's why. Nevertheless, I'm so happy to be with all of you. I was more than thrilled to accept this invitation. This is such a critical moment, I think, for all of us, for this nation, and certainly for the entire world. I am, like Ms. Martin said, I am Tavares Floyd, and I am the cousin of George Floyd. I am a civil rights attorney. I've been on the battlefield for quite some time now, so I'm not really new to this scene. I've been fighting for justice for a long, long time. And so now we're in a very peculiar place at a crossroads. And so certainly I think it's more important for us now to be advocating and doing the things that we need to do now more than ever. One of the topics of the panel discussion today was really focusing on racism in policing. And I think that's critically important for us to look at biased law enforcement policies and how we can prevent this. But I think the more important question is, how do we really measure this? And racism, as many of you will know, is basically the marginalization of or the oppression of people of color based on socially constructed systems and hierarchies that privilege white people. And so for a long, long time in this country, race continues to be a factor that tremendously influences communities of color. And, you know, when the death of Perry, as my family knows George by, happened, you know, it kind of took me to a very different place, you know, where I've always been accustomed to racism having this systematic feature and stain on the American society. It became something quite different when a family member is killed and reality is at your back door. You know, I think that since the inception of this country, we've been ruled and we've been run by systemic racial issues in our law enforcement. But I think now is a critical time for us to really get it right. But in order for us to do that, we have to acknowledge, you know, the roles that these implicit biases and overt biases have played historically throughout this country. And so now I think that we need to be looking at our practices. We need to be looking at the many frictions that the African American community has had with the police as it relates to this. And this is a reality that we can no longer wait to address. We need to be doing it now. You know, as we talk about racism in policing, I think that another critical thing for us to hone into is really, as we're focusing on making change and we're assigning officers, Caucasians and Hispanics and Asians, and sometimes even African-American officers to poor neighborhoods, predominantly African-American neighborhoods. And we're putting these officers in place who have little to no contact, social contact with these particular communities. We need to be sure that we are clear that this is an ongoing recipe for disaster. And so, you know, sometimes when we're putting these officers in these neighborhoods, they're bringing with them negative attitudes, they're bringing with them stereotypes that obviously will impact the way that they make their decisions, and fairness will come into play as it relates to their enforcement actions. So I think that we need to be focusing on really peeling back positional power that whites have had in our policing policies for quite some time, policies that have created such a situation that has essentially made it difficult to overcome any kind of community policing initiatives. And so African Americans across this nation are aware and we are concerned about the ongoing existence of race, racial profiling in this particular segment that we're talking about, African Americans, and that's going on every day with so many police departments. You know, we're looking at saying that we want change, and one of those elements has to be cooperation with police. Well, that is certainly true, and I think that it's predicated in a large part of minority communities on how minorities perceive what fairness really is as it relates to treatment by police officers. And so because we have this desperate treatment of minorities, it's counterproductive by members of the police department. We need to be looking at zero tolerance policy tactics. And you know, this is not something that's really new to the African-American community. We've been there. But one of the things I think that we have an advantage with is we're looking at, now we have cell phone usage where people are able to have cameras and recording capabilities where people are able to witness incidences and confrontations and quickly post those types of things to social media. And it wasn't too long ago that some police departments and some elected officials, if you want to be quite candid, were forced with, were tasked with enforcing certain apartheid laws and customs to the African-American community. So I want to be clear that we have not forgotten about those, and certainly we will not forget about those things. But I think that as we move forward with the criminal justice system, one that was built and honed and firmly established during the Jim Crow era, a time when almost everybody, I think, can agree, even conservatives, we can all concede that they were built with rife with racism, and this is pretty intuitive. And so the same modern day criminal justice system that has helped preserve racial tensions throughout this country is the same system that has essentially kept Black people in their places. And so we've been fighting for this for a long time. And I want to say to everybody that what we see going on today, some of those proclivities is really not a surprise. This is an ongoing issue that we've been dealing with. And as we talk about race with policing, I want to be sure to say that this is certainly not the only thing that we need to be worried about in the criminal justice system. There are obviously other issues that are inextricable, but the reality and the fact of the matter is that when you have these already existing issues, and then you factor race into this, then you have a situation that is exacerbated. And so I think we need to be having in-depth conversations, and we need to be having dialogues that really influence race and racism and interactions between law enforcement and the community, particularly communities of color, African-American communities. And so I think in doing so that we're creating a conversation and we're digging deep. This is a call to action. I've been asking people to step up, don't talk about it, but also be about it. So I think that we're at the crossroads, and the perfect opportunity is here. The problems that we're facing cannot and will not be solved until there is some kind of a cosmic discontent that is really being enlarged from human beings, from all of us, from the very bosoms of our beings. And until we can do that, then real change will not happen. But I am content that we are there, and this is the perfect moment for us to move forward as one.
Wow. Thank you. I am in awe of your peace, of the peace that you have, notwithstanding all the challenges and the things that your family is being faced with. I truly appreciate your ability to articulate where it begins and where we are now, and that it is more than your cousin, that he is a symptom of a more systemic issue that we have to deal with.
Absolutely.
Hold your place, because we're going to be coming back to you, and we're going to have like a 15-minute discussion at the end. So please hold that thought. And we're now going to move to Representative David James Mack. Selma, if you could put him on spotlight, I'd appreciate it.
Did I do it correctly?
You did a fabulous job, dear. Representative Mack comes from Charleston, South Carolina. He's a member of the State House Representatives, member of the Labor, Commerce, and Industry Committee. He is the chairman of the Banking and Consumer Affairs Subcommittee and serves on the Public Utilities Review Committee. He has done phenomenal work in Charleston, South Carolina. He's a recipient of numerous awards from everybody. He's an alum, which I don't know why you didn't put this on your resume, or maybe, oh, you did. He's an alum of Howard University. And most important, he is my cousin.
Boom.
Yes, I am beyond excited that he was able to arrange his schedule to be here with us. We're going to move from policing to legislation. And when I thought about all the people that I knew that influenced legislation as it relates to racism, my first thought was you, David, because we know what Charleston is all about. We know the different things that have happened there. And we also know how you have been influential in bringing those things to the surface from a legislative perspective. So if you would speak to what works, what have you seen works to make that change, and how we take this resolution to the next level.
Well, thank you. It's so good to be with you and the other panelists, and just being in this atmosphere. I think in this climate we're in right now, everything from the pandemic to the many things of racism that have been documented, that it's very important that we have a mindset, but not only a mindset, but a game plan of how to move. From a legislative standpoint, one of the challenging parts is it's all about numbers. I'm also a former chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, and some of the simple things like getting African-American judges. When I was chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, we got frustrated to the point that we had a walkout of the legislature, the South Carolina General Assembly, the House and the Senate. We are the ones that will vote for who gets to be a judge in the state of South Carolina. And we did in the mid 2000s, we actually did a walkout, and we leveraged a lot of things and did a lot of work to begin to change those numbers. But legislation is so key. And let me say this about African-American legislators around the country. The challenge we have is always going to be the numbers, being outnumbered, getting good legislation. And I always say there's 5 things that everybody wants, not only Black folk, but everybody. They want a good educational system for their children, a well-paying job, entrepreneur opportunity, health care, a decent place to live, and a lot of times those things are done through legislation. So it's going to be very important, and I'm very excited, very happy about all the rallies and marches that are happening around the world and how diverse they are. That's a very positive thing too. But we're going to have to take that energy, that mindset, that inspiration to the ballot box in November 3rd. And I think all of us on this conference is sharp enough to know the number one thing we have to do on November 3rd. But we have to get folks in with a set of values that will reflect those things that we talked about. Now, as far as policing is concerned, there was a study done that said that about 12 to 13% of law enforcement officers throughout the country are bona fide members of the Ku Klux Klan. That study was not done by the NAACP. It was not done by the National Action Network. It was done by the FBI. So there's a problem. So again, not to indict all police officers, but how do we deal with that segment of law enforcement officers that are problematic? We've done legislation such as body cameras. The Speaker of the South Carolina House has put together a task force to look at policing again. And I think the time is right. Believe it or not, the John C. Calhoun statue, if folks had ever been to Charleston and Alpharetta, we were talking about this the other day, this is home for you too, is that that large statue is about to come down. The mayor is doing a resolution. There's a majority vote on city council. It's on private property. So it's looking to come down. So we've got that. We've just dealt with the anniversary of the Emanuel 9, the massacre at Emanuel AME Church here in Charleston. We just had the Juneteenth. We've had the various murders from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor to Rashad Brooks, Ahmaud Arbery. All of these folks have been murdered. USC and Clemson, they are looking to, the boards are looking to get rid of some of the Confederate statues and change some of the names. For example, there's a women's dormitory on the University of South Carolina named after J. Marion Sims. Now, who is James Marion Sims? He's referred to as the father of gynecology. He used to work on African women, African slaves, without anesthesia. Just cut them up, write papers on them, and just throw the carcass away. Time after time after time. There was a ladies' dormitory named after this guy. Aunt Jemima is going to be retired. The NFL is looking to do some things. So now is the time. Now is the time to really do some things. And we were able to take the Confederate flag out of off the State House grounds. It was after the Emanuel 9 murder, when folks are at an emotional level where you can get things done. So we have to push the ball forward. I would urge everyone to talk to their legislators, wherever they are, black and white, Democrat and Republican, see what they're saying, because this is about decency. And my last point, I say this about statues all the time. And people say, well, it's part of your history. It's part of our history. It's part of our history. Yes, it's part of our history. But I would say to anyone, if somebody has raped somebody in your family, yes, it's part of your history, but would you want to see a statue commemorating that person that raped somebody in your family? And with these, and when you're talking about slavery, we're talking about rape, we're talking about lynching, we're talking about castrations, you're talking about babies being given away, families being separated, you're talking about people being dragged by horses until they're beheaded. You're talking about the worst of the worst in terms of anti-human, being anti-human. So that's where we are. And now's the time for everyone to play a role, speak to their legislators, speak to their members of city and county council, and to work to deal with this issue of race. Because we know what's right and wrong. I always say, when you get a 2-year-old, since the age we were 2, we knew what was right or wrong. It doesn't matter whether we want to do it. Why I say 2? Because a 2-year-old, when they're walking and they're reaching for something they know they're not supposed to reach for, they'll look back and see if you're looking. They know they're wrong. So anyway, those are my comments.
David, I thank you. I thank you. I thank you for being blunt. I mean, being direct, saying what it is. And you come, we just had that anniversary of the Emanuel 9, and now we're mourning. And I think I want to say this: when African Americans mourn, we wear a mask, and many times you don't know the extent of our grieving until something happens and we say enough. And we're at that point, and we're at a point where the whole world sees us and feels our pain. Thank you. We're going to come back to you when we have the Q&A. Everybody who's been listening, please start thinking of questions you want to ask the panelists. We're about to go into our last panel, and this is a co-panel between Stephen Spitz and Andrea Miller. The first speaker will be Andrea Miller, who is a strategist. She actually lives here in Virginia for Get Out the Vote. Their panel will be about voting and voting disenfranchisement. She has been with this organization since 2016. She also was the monitor, the great monitor of our panel this past Monday, where we had candidates forum. And all those candidates who were running for DNC were pleased. And we were pleased she was able to teach me a thing or two about how to run this thing we call Zoom. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Andrea, so she can talk a little bit about her vote and how African Americans are disenfranchised and the things that we can do about that.
Arthuretta, thank you so very much for inviting me. There are so many ways that African Americans, and I'm going to just say people of color, end up getting disenfranchised. And one of the easiest things that happens is we like to mistakenly talk about the right to vote. If we admit, no, some of us have the ability to vote and some of us don't, I think that might help people be aware of how much on guard they really need to be to protect their ability to vote. In virtually all states, if you don't vote in a certain number of federal elections, and it varies by state, you will lose your ability to vote. They will move you to the inactive list, otherwise known as the pre-purge list. You get to be on the inactive list, and again, it varies state by state, but eventually, if you are on that list, normally 2-3 years, the next step will be deregistration, meaning you will be unregistered. And that is something that most voters just don't understand. If you do not use your ability to vote, you will lose that ability to vote. Now, in America, when this country was founded and they decided that it was a country, they gave the right to vote to the 1% of their day. You were rich, you were white, and you were male. If you could not check all three boxes, you were not voting in this new country called America. We have expanded the right or the ability to vote through constitutional amendment. But there's always that danger that we will lose the ability. So I always tell every voter that I encounter, check the status of your voter registration at least 3 times a year. Most of us remember interstate cross-check, that insanity perpetrated by Chris Kobach when he was Secretary of State in Kansas. Well, 22 states signed up for that thing, and they ultimately took away the ability to vote of roughly 8 million people in the United States, simply because Chris Kobach said, oh, I have a voter in this state whose name is Aubrey Washington, and I've got a voter in Georgia whose name is Aubrey Washington. Aubrey Washington must be voting in 2 states. And that's really all they were looking at. They were looking at names. And there's kind of a science of names if you really study them. It's easy to tell community of color names when you really study it. And this interstate cross-check system was a targeted surgical study in mass disenfranchisement of people who never should have lost their ability to vote. And a lot of these folks were pretty darn consistent voters. That's gone thanks to the ACLU in 2019. But what is still here is the right of every state to maintain its voter rolls. Now, here's some numbers, and these are Virginia numbers, and this is as of right now, right here today. In Virginia, there are 5,351,881 people where if they held an election tomorrow, they could go vote. So they will have the ability to go vote on Tuesday. Now, of that 5.3 million voters, 171,852 of them are on the inactive list. So if they don't go and vote Tuesday, if they don't get active or take some action, there is a very good possibility that they may not even have the ability to vote come November, because they are on the inactive list. So by August is normally when states are no longer allowed to dump voters from their rolls. So if they are still there on August, they'll be good for November. Now, Virginia has 1.5 million voters who have been deregistered, meaning they are no longer registered to vote. And if they show up to vote on election day, they are going to either A, be denied the ability to vote, or B, they're going to get a provisional ballot that probably won't be counted. And when we vote, the whole idea is we are voting so that our voice, our vote matters and it gets counted. So this is really an area that we have to look at, and our organization works very hard. We let voters know when they are on that inactive list, you're about to be maintained off the voting rolls. And also when people have been removed to the voting rolls, we say, now, sometimes our lists aren't correct. Please go and check your voter registration status and make sure that you will still be able to exercise your ability to vote. Thanks.
So informative. So very informative. It's like the foundation of everything we're talking about. That's voting, because voting affects every other piece of that. Thank you so much, Andrea. The next panelist is someone that helped to co-author the resolution with me. His name is Stephen Spitz. Now, Stephen's video, he wasn't quite able to get on, so what you will see is just Stephen's phone. You'll see his name and phone. So are you able to pull that up?
I put you on spotlight. I can't spotlight someone who doesn't have a camera on. So now we're all just at you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you. Let me give this little introduction and then make sure everyone is mute so we can hear Stephen. I do want to give him his props. He helped me at least 2 or 3 hours to write that resolution. I knew what I wanted, but I didn't quite know how to say it. And he helped me to do that. So I thank you so much. All of the names contributed. Stephen contributed significantly. And there's a reason for that. He is a retired civil rights attorney. He is currently co-chair of the Election Law and Voter Protection Committee of the Fairfax County Democratic Party. He's also the Virginia State Coordinator of Progressive Democrats of America, and he's the coordinator of Our Revolution Falls Church. This man is an activist, an advocate, and a lover of people, and I appreciate him very much. Stephen, if you can talk about your experiences with voter disenfranchisement from a historical perspective, and after you share what you know, then we'll start asking some questions.
Thank you, Arthuretta, and I really do appreciate what you have done. And I want to point out to Mr. Floyd that Arthuretta actually submitted the resolution before the murder of George Floyd. So this is very timely. I wanted to talk about 2 aspects that directly negatively impact African Americans in terms of voting. One is the complete disenfranchisement for life, for the rest of your life, if you have a felony conviction, unless you are restored to the vote by the governor of the state. This is an extremely unusual discriminatory provision. In the 1902 Constitution in Virginia, it set up poll taxes, literacy tests, and disenfranchisement as felons in order to make clear that this was a primary method of disenfranchising African Americans. The sponsor of the bill said, this will keep the darkies from voting. This will keep the darkies from voting. Well, every governor after that restored, token numbers of people. I'm talking about Democratic governors, Republican governors. To his credit, I'm not saying that I and my friend Andrea, among many others, were lobbying all of these folks. But finally, Governor Terry McAuliffe, on April 22nd, 2016, issued an executive order to re-enfranchise 206,000 Virginians. That was challenged in court He was told by the court that he couldn't do it as a blanket executive order, so he just did it individually. On the floor of the Democratic National Convention, where I was a national delegate for Bernie Sanders in 2016, Terry McAuliffe was on the floor, and I said, Terry, this was the greatest accomplishment in your tenure as governor, and he said, oh, I totally agree. But let me give you some of the sad statistics about this. And by the way, this is still in the Virginia Constitution, that you cannot vote for the rest of your life unless the governor restores your right to vote. The ACLU of Virginia has made this a legislative priority, but the legislature still has not voted a constitutional amendment to submit to the voters to eliminate this. When the McAuliffe administration restored these folks, 52% of them were white, 46% was black, obviously much larger than the percentage of Black Americans in Virginia in the total population. There were more than 1,100 people in their 80s and 367 people over the age of 90 that were included in the restoration. In other words, you're talking about people who basically have not voted in their entire lives, and they just have the right to register to vote when they're in their 80s or 90s. I have met folks who had committed or gotten convicted, whether they had committed it or not, of a felony, who hadn't voted ever, because at the time you had to be 21 to vote, and they were a teenager when they had their felony conviction. So here they are for the first time in their 40s, 50s, and later voting. So fortunately right now, Governor Northam has extended that policy to restore people with felony convictions. But a future governor can decide not to do that if this constitutional provision is not overturned. So that's the first thing I wanted to suggest, is that we all work to overturn and eliminate that very racist constitutional provision in the Virginia Constitution. Secondly, and this is a huge problem nationally, including, of course, in Virginia, is the 2013 decision of the United States Supreme Court in Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. The Shelby County decision effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Basically, they said that the requirement of pre-clearance, that means before you do things like moving a polling place, consolidating polling locations, doing anything in terms of elections, you had to get the permission of the Justice Department or a court. That was how the Voting Rights Act enacted in 1965 and renewed subsequently worked. But this basically eliminated it on the pretense that somehow there wasn't sufficient evidence to do that, which is actually factually untrue, as Congress had thousands of pages of testimony about ongoing discrimination and litigation in the states, in mostly southern states, but not exclusively southern states, where the pre-clearance requirement applied. So right now we have a situation where effectively the burden is on the voter to try to prove discrimination rather than on the jurisdiction to try to demonstrate that a change in election procedures was not discriminatory. So that's basically it.
Wow. Thank you very much, Stephen, for giving us that history lesson about why we are where we are. I know from my own studies of history, that period of Reconstruction, which ended much sooner than we had hoped, was when African Americans were making enormous achievements. And these Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow statutes, separate but equal, all of these things happened as a result of the progress that African Americans were making. And you made it clear how that has panned out and how it has become systemic part of Virginia dating back from the early 1900s. Now we're here in 2020 dealing with the same issues. So I now would like to open up the panel for us to talk about this. We have about 15 minutes and we're going to talk about our game plan, that when we leave, each person that's on this call will at least have one thing they will do to influence and improve the quality of life for people who have been here for generations. And by improving the quality of life for others, you'll be improving the quality of life for yourself. So Karishma, if you can unmute and ask the questions, and if you have any.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. We do have a couple questions coming in. I'll start from the beginning. Lillian Brooks asked, can we get federal law to force states to remove laws on their books on lynching, chokeholds?
Okay. I'm going to ask Mr. Floyd, Attorney Floyd, if you could address that. Well, you know, we have a national anti-lynching law that's being held up by Senator Rand Paul. I don't know if he has a change of conscience right now, but there are every state can do something. So what is your opinion on what can be done with that?
Absolutely. So great question. I think that it is critically important for us to be looking at and analyzing, taking these egregious laws off of the book. And as some of you are aware, we are—
that makes no sense.
We are seeing federal legislation that's on the table. And I think one of the issues that we're dealing with now is simply biases. But at the end of the day, the most important thing for us to do at this point is to implement these federal laws. And I think that we should be raising our voices as individuals. And just to piggyback off of what you just said, we need to figure out how we can impact this on individual levels. And it is so important for us, you know, whether small or large, to each play a critical role in this process. And so there are legislation papers that are on the table as we speak, and they are being held up simply because some people just don't want to do the right thing. So I think that if we're looking at one of the things that I'm particularly interested in as it relates to police reform is banning chokeholds, and then looking at how we can boost police training and excessive use of force, and also looking at mandating citizen review boards to boost oversight of police misconduct. Also legislation nationwide and here in the Commonwealth of Virginia for body camera footage to be released within 30 days of when force was used by police officers that caused injury or death, and also rethinking police presence in the schools. And I think all of these things have had such a disproportionate impact on the African American community and communities of color. And so certainly we need to be reaching out to our legislators, to Congress, to make these things happen.
Thank you. Representative Mack, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that is right on point. Right on point. It's a matter of who we have in these bodies. And as I said before, we have to, November 3rd is so critical because we have to do our homework and put folks in place that share our values. And sometimes it's people will say, well, the least of two evils, when I don't like to use that term, but sometimes folks that are a little more moderate, or sometimes folks that you can have a conversation with, that you can talk with, and to get them to do some of the basic things as relates to humanity. And that's basically where we are. So we have to have these conversations. We have to go in with an agenda as to what we want. As was mentioned, we had two different versions from the U.S. Senate. Tim Scott presented one for police reform, and a couple of the House members in Washington presented one. The House version was much better because, again, we have to deal with the chokeholds and a lot of different things as relates to the process. We have to make sure that law enforcement folks, and again, we respect them and respect all that they do, but they have to be held accountable when they do wrong, especially when they murder someone.
Thank you. Thank you. Karishma.
Okay, next question is Nora Dell. And this is in regards to the voter registration. Why have an inactive list? And why aren't you registered for life? Is it possible to amend individual state voting codes to get rid of an inactive list?
Stephen, can you answer that one? Or Andrea,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Again, it does go back to voting is not a constitutional right. If voting were a constitutional right, then what Stephen talked about in terms of felony disenfranchisement would not be an issue. There are 48 states that have some form of felony disenfranchisement. The two states that don't have the smallest community have incredibly small community of color populations. So again, the states have claimed they do need to be able to maintain their voter rolls, and their attitude is if you have not voted, in the case of Virginia, it would be in the 9th year. If you do not vote, they will remove you from the rolls. Their feeling is you don't want to vote, so we don't need to have you on the rolls. They also look at change of address. Do they have a change of address form? Many states now use ERIC rather than cross-check. And so if they have something that indicates there was a change of address filed with the United States Postal Service or on the Social Security database, someone has filed for death benefits, then they will also either move you to inactive, if not completely unregister you. Every once in a while, they get a false positive.
Okay, thank you. Karishma. Oh, I do want to say about Karishma. Karishma was also one of the co-sponsors of the bill. And I'm sorry, Bill. Now, see, I'm moving from resolution to bill already. She was one of the co-sponsors of the resolution, and I appreciate her support and her help. Karishma, what is the next question?
Arthuretta, I'm not seeing any additional questions that weren't answered. A couple of them were answered by our wonderful panelists directly in the chat.
Okay.
If there are more questions, everyone, please feel free to add to the chat.
All right. Well, I have a couple of questions myself that I want to address to Attorney Floyd. And this has to do with something that Representative Mack said, and that is the definition of lynching. We didn't really get to talk directly about it, but the definition of lynching. Right now, last year, 5 young people were found hanging from a tree. and these were Black people found hanging from a tree in this country. That is what in many people's minds they perceive as lynching. But lynching comes in a lot of different ways. Can you help us to understand what needs to be changed in legislation to clearly define what lynching is?
Well, am I on?
Yes,
Okay.
and she's getting ready to flip to pin you.
Well, you know, I think that we've been looking at racial tensions and lynching since the 19th century. And, you know, most critically during 1882 to 1968, we had, you know, several lynchings that occurred in the US. And many of those lynchings, Black people accounted for them. And so the question has always been, were those lynchings necessary? And I think that we have to be clear that as we talk about this, is that we have to understand that most of those lynchings took place in the South. And the large majority of that reason was because of the end of the Civil War. And people, African Americans, wanted to gain their freedom. People wanted to be free. And I think the question really is a part of a larger question. And I think it all relates and falls back to mindset. I think that as we think through what a lynching is, you know, modern day lynching is all about the mental capacities. And you know, there are still instances of persons of color that are, as we've seen most recently in California, two alleged lynchings that the police are still investigating. So it's still prevalent. And so that should be something that resonates with all of us, that the same things that were happening in the 19th century are still alive and well today. But the most important thing that we can do is to change the way that we think. We need to be coming to the table. We all need to be a part of the table. I think that the people that are at the table need to be composed and comprised of a diverse group of people, persons that have traditionally been left out of having a seat at the table. I think that as we move forward, it is going to be critically important for us to be putting new policies and new laws into place that call for change, that demand change. And I think one way for us to do that is either have a seat at the table, or either know someone that is sitting at the table. And I think that we can do this together. And, you know, I'm hearing people all over the place say that they want to see change. And I think the most important way that we can make that happen is for each of us to be that change. And so I think that as we're looking at things like lynching and, you know, understanding what lynching means or what modern day lynching is, it's important for us to each and for all of us to understand that in order for us to eradicate any of this, we have to be genuine, we have to be passionate, we have to listen, we have to be listening to each other. And, you know, the process is going to be uncomfortable at times. And, you know, that's the beauty of life, is being uncomfortable. And that's where the actual change happens. I remember hearing you earlier saying that you were in awe of my piece. You know, I think I am on an emotional roller coaster. My emotions can never be determined. Some days I wake up and I'm angry. Some days I'm sad. Some days I'm somber. Some days I'm filled with happiness. But what I'm trying to do is bottle all of those emotions up and see how I can best channel and move forward and create the change that is long overdue for this country and for my people.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you. We have a hand raised, and I must acknowledge Colonel Jim Page, because if it were not for him, we would not have Attorney Floyd here. So, Mr. Page, you are unmuted and feel free to share.
I guess I'm glad to be here. To all of us, boy, what a good day. Let me echo what Dolores just said. Some days you're sad, other days you're angry, but today is one of inspiration. this is really good stuff that we're doing. My question to everybody is a focus on education for underserved kids. Do we have a national plan, a local plan? And then how can we work more closely together to make sure that we can fill that gap? And I'll just throw it out to anybody who wants to take a stab at that.
We have 1 minute. It was actually one of the things that is part of the resolution. And so I'll go ahead and take that. There's significant studies about the disparate treatment of Black and children of color and disabled children suffer adversely in school environments. And by them being in that position, that plays out in so many ways in their development, in their educational experience. And there's not enough being done there. We're now just acknowledging it, but there's a significant amount that needs to be done. So as we close this panel, I had identified 6, and I said not to be limited to 6 areas that we need to do work in. There's education. Health was mentioned, and by the way, there's one of those monuments that's in New York City as well to the gynecologists that did those horrible things to enslaved women. There's policing. There is the healthcare system itself, education system, monetary system, rent, everything, as I tell people, that's in our lives, if you can imagine. It touches us on a daily basis in some way, shape, or form. So I challenge everybody on this call. Find one thing, one area that is your area of expertise, and then start seeing where the racism may play out. And then you identify how you can make a change. You can make a change. One of the things that I close with, and I'm going to close here with this. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will. So y'all better start demanding some change. I thank you all for being here. I'm in awe. I thank every one of my panelists. You'll be getting kissies in the mail or something to show all of my appreciation for you. And now I will be turning over to the next panel. Thank you so much.